When World War II finally ended, Britain faced a peculiar problem. It had an entire fleet of motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, that had been absolutely vital during the conflict, yet were suddenly without a clear purpose. These small, high-speed vessels had been the sharp edge of Britain's coastal defense and offensive capabilities. They had darted through minefields, patrolled perilous channels, and struck deep into enemy waters with torpedoes that could destroy much larger ships. They were fast, agile, and deceptively powerful, built for a kind of warfare that demanded precision, courage, and a willingness to embrace danger. Yet in peacetime, their very qualities, speed, maneuverability, and light armor, made them less relevant in a world where conventional naval threats had diminished almost overnight. The end of the war created a sudden surplus of MTBs, and the Royal Navy had to make decisions that were as much logistical as they were strategic. Hundreds of these boats, once the pride of Britain's coastal squadrons, were no longer needed in active service. They had been optimized for a very specific kind of combat, one that no longer existed in the post-war geopolitical landscape. Maintaining them was expensive. Fuel, crews, and maintenance for high-performance vessels that would now sit idle in harbors or on moorings created a burden the Navy could not justify. For some officers, it was almost painful to see these war machines, which had proven themselves in daring raids and nighttime operations, reduced to mere inventory items in naval yards. Many MTBs were decommissioned and placed into storage or mothballed in harbors around the United Kingdom. These vessels were carefully preserved at first, wrapped against the elements and sometimes kept ready for future training exercises or emergencies. Yet over time, the harsh realities of peacetime budgets, manpower shortages, and rapid technological change meant that many boats were left to decay or were gradually scrapped. The story of these vessels became one of transition, from instruments of destruction to relics of a war that had already reshaped the world. This period of surplus also highlighted a broader truth about post-war Britain. The nation had to pivot from a wartime footing to peacetime priorities almost overnight. Shipyards that had once been alive with production now faced closures, while naval officers who had spent years on combat missions were reassigned to training, administration, or civilian life. MTBs, once central to Britain's coastal strategy, became symbolic of this shift. They were a tangible reminder that the war was over, that the intense urgency of wartime innovation had passed, and that even the most heroic machines could become obsolete in a matter of months. Some MTBs were initially kept in reserve, anticipating that they might be needed for new roles, either in training exercises or in future conflicts that were still unimaginable. For instance, naval exercises in the early post-war years used MTBs to simulate attacks on larger vessels, teaching new generations of sailors about speed, evasion, and small craft tactics. However, these uses were limited. As jet aircraft, guided missiles, and larger, more advanced ships came into play, the strategic importance of these small torpedo boats waned. What had been a cutting-edge tool for coastal warfare became a stopgap measure, valuable only for training or secondary roles. The story of Britain's MTBs after the war also reflects the broader challenge of transitioning military technology from wartime urgency to peacetime practicality. These boats were marvels of engineering, lightweight, fast, and optimized for a very specific type of naval combat. But peacetime did not require the extraordinary risk-taking that had justified their design. Many MTBs were gradually stripped for parts, sold off, or even sunk as practice targets for newer weapons. Each boat that was decommissioned carried a story. The raids it had run, the enemy ships it had engaged, the crew members who had risked everything in a vessel barely more than a speedboat in size. Yet even in their redundancy, MTBs held a certain allure. Their sleek lines, powerful engines, and legendary wartime exploits captured the imagination of sailors, historians, and, later, civilian enthusiasts. They became icons of an era when ingenuity and daring defined naval warfare. These boats, once essential for Britain's survival and victory, were now reminders of both the intensity of the conflict and the rapid pace at which technology and circumstance could render even the most advanced machines surplus. Ultimately, the post-war fate of Britain's motor torpedo boats underscores a paradox of wartime innovation. Something created to save lives and win battles can, almost overnight, become a logistical headache, a symbol of obsolescence, and a relic of history. They were no longer the swift predators of the seas but rather silent witnesses to the transition. From total war to uneasy peace. Their stories, preserved in records, photographs, and the few surviving vessels, offer a glimpse into a time when speed and precision at sea meant the difference between survival and destruction, and when the end of conflict transformed heroes into history. Even after World War II ended and most of Britain's motor torpedo boats were decommissioned or mothballed, not all of them were destined for a quiet, forgotten life. Some of these vessels found a second act in the shadows, repurposed for secret roles that few outside naval circles ever knew about. The same speed, maneuverability, and compact design that made them deadly on the coasts of occupied Europe now made them ideal for intelligence missions, covert operations, and experimental naval tasks in the uncertain early years of the Cold War. While the world assumed these boats were relics of the past, in reality, they continued to serve in ways that were less visible but equally important. One of the most intriguing aspects of these post-war operations was the use of MTBs for surveillance and reconnaissance. Their small size and agility allowed them to slip into waters that were otherwise difficult to patrol without detection. Along the coasts of Europe, they could monitor shipping traffic, test enemy responses, or gather intelligence on the remnants of former Axis forces. These missions were often classified, with crews operating under strict secrecy and limited guidance. For the sailors involved, this work was worlds apart from the conventional combat missions they had undertaken during the war. There were no dramatic torpedo attacks or high-speed chases under moonlight, but the stakes remained high. Being discovered in hostile or politically sensitive waters could lead to serious consequences, and the very nature of clandestine operations demanded precision, discipline, and nerve. MTBs were also utilized in experimental roles to test new naval technologies and tactics. For example, some boats were outfitted with advanced radar systems, experimental weapons, or communication equipment that would later be implemented in the Royal Navy's broader fleet. Their compact design made them ideal for such testing because they could maneuver quickly and operate close to shore without drawing too much attention. Engineers and naval officers used these vessels as platforms to push the boundaries of post-war naval innovation, bridging the gap between wartime experience and the emerging Cold War era. In this sense, the MTBs became laboratories of opportunity, proving that even small, seemingly obsolete craft could contribute to military advancement in unexpected ways. Beyond surveillance and experimentation, MTBs were sometimes involved in covert operations. While few specific missions have been publicly documented, historical records indicate that certain boats were used to transport agents, equipment, and supplies to strategic locations along Europe's coasts. Their ability to move swiftly, avoid detection, and navigate shallow or complex waterways made them ideal for operations that larger ships could not manage. These secret roles required a careful balance of skill, timing, and intelligence, qualities that MTB crews had honed during the war, making them perfectly suited for the delicate work of post-war operations. These covert and experimental roles highlight a fascinating paradox. The same boats that were considered surplus or obsolete by official standards were, in practice, uniquely suited for new, clandestine tasks. Their value had shifted from overt combat power to stealth, versatility, and utility in specialized operations. This transition underscores how military assets are often repurposed rather than discarded, finding new life in ways that reflect changing strategic priorities. For the crews, this meant adapting to a different kind of challenge, one that relied less on firepower and more on precision, timing, and secrecy. The post-war use of MTBs also sheds light on Britain's strategic thinking during the early Cold War. The Royal Navy recognized that traditional threats were changing, and small, fast craft could provide intelligence, rapid response capability, and a testing ground for emerging technologies. While these missions were rarely publicized, they contributed to Britain's ability to maintain influence and readiness in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. The MTBs became unsung workhorses, quietly supporting the nation's security while remaining largely invisible to the public eye. Ultimately, the story of these secret post-war roles adds depth to our understanding of the MTBs' legacy. They were no longer instruments of war in the conventional sense, yet they continued to serve in ways that were just as strategic, if not more subtle. From surveillance and intelligence gathering to experimental testing and clandestine operations, these boats demonstrated adaptability that extended far beyond the battlefield. The post-war MTBs remind us that the life of a military asset does not end with a peace treaty or decommissioning ceremony. Sometimes, their greatest contributions are hidden, quietly shaping the next chapter of history while the world assumes they have faded into memory. In exploring these secretive post-war missions, we gain a new appreciation for the ingenuity of the Royal Navy and the crews who adapted to evolving challenges. The MTBs were vessels of war, yes, but they were also vessels of opportunity. Small, fast, and versatile, capable of fulfilling roles that larger, more conventional ships could never attempt. Their story after the war is a testament to the enduring value of speed, agility, and adaptability, showing that even in peacetime, these boats had a purpose that extended far beyond their original design. As the years passed after World War II, Britain's motor torpedo boats gradually began to leave military service. But their story didn't end there. Many of these small, fast, and versatile vessels found new life in civilian hands, transitioning from deadly war machines to tools of recreation, sport, and historical preservation. It was a transformation that reflected both the changing times and the enduring fascination with these agile boats. Vessels that had once been on the cutting edge of naval warfare and were now becoming part of Britain's maritime heritage. Some MTBs were converted into pleasure craft, stripped of their torpedoes and mounted with engines suitable for recreational use. Their speed and sleek lines made them ideal for racing, coastal cruising, or weekend adventures on rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. For civilians, owning an MTB was not just about the mechanics of the boat. It was about owning a piece of history. These vessels carried stories of daring raids, stealth missions, and high-stakes naval engagements, giving owners the sense that they were handling a craft that had once played a critical role in Britain's survival. It was a tangible connection to the past, a way to experience, even in miniature, the thrill of the daring maneuvers that had defined wartime operations. Others were sold for scrap or partially dismantled, their engines, fittings, and hulls repurposed for civilian industrial use. In some cases, the transformation was more practical than romantic, with these materials feeding into the post-war reconstruction of Britain, where steel and machinery were in high demand. Yet even in this form, the legacy of the MTBs endured, hidden in bridges, vehicles, or other machinery where the spirit of their design lived on. A smaller but notable number of MTBs were preserved as museum exhibits or historical artifacts. Naval museums across the UK and Europe recognized the significance of these vessels, both in terms of engineering innovation and historical impact. Restored and displayed, they became educational tools, allowing visitors to see the design, technology, and scale of these craft up close. For many, seeing an MTB in person brought the realities of wartime naval operations to life in a way that books and photographs could not. These preserved boats served as reminders of both the courage of the crews who manned them and the technological ingenuity that allowed such small vessels to make a disproportionate impact during the war. The civilian adaptation of MTBs also highlights the broader story of post-war Britain, a nation shifting from a wartime economy to peacetime priorities. Recreational boating was becoming increasingly popular, and these former military vessels offered a unique blend of performance, history, and exclusivity. Their speed and agility, which had been essential for attacking enemy convoys, made them ideal for sport and leisure, while their military origins added an unmistakable aura of prestige. Enthusiasts who restored and raced MTBs often did so with reverence, preserving as much of the original equipment and design as possible, keeping the memory of the war alive in tangible, hands-on ways. Some MTBs, however, were lost entirely. Harsh maritime conditions, neglect, or accidents claimed a number of these boats, leaving only fragments for historians and collectors. Others were deliberately sunk as targets during training exercises or disposal operations, their lives ending where they had once trained for war. Even in these losses, the vessel's stories contribute to the narrative of transition, from instruments of conflict to objects of historical reflection, their destruction serving as a final, if somber, chapter in their operational lives. The legacy of MTBs in civilian life underscores a remarkable adaptability. A boat that had been built for the perils of night raids and coastal ambushes could be transformed into a pleasure craft, a racing vessel, or a museum exhibit. Each transition required creativity, investment, and a recognition that these boats were more than just machines. They were artifacts of national history and symbols of technological achievement. Their continued existence in civilian contexts kept the memory of the crews, missions, and daring exploits alive for new generations, ensuring that the lessons of wartime naval operations were not lost to time. Ultimately, the story of MTBs after World War II is one of transformation and preservation. From war machines to civilian pleasure craft, from experimental targets to museum pieces, these boats carried their history into a new era. They remind us that military technology, while often created for destruction, can find renewed purpose in peace, inspiring fascination, recreation, and education. The motor torpedo boats that once danced along Europe's coasts in the dark of night now glide into the imagination of history enthusiasts, preserving a legacy that is as much about human ingenuity and adaptability as it is about war itself. The journey of these vessels, from deadly naval assets to cherished historical artifacts, illustrates a profound truth about the aftermath of conflict. Even tools of war can evolve, finding new life and relevance long after the battles have ended. In their speed, design, and enduring presence, Britain's MTBs continue to captivate, serving as living reminders of a time when courage, skill, and technology converged on the high seas.